So wonderful. Suppressing is not the way.
Yeah.
So
No.
would you
Go ahead.
talk about that?
Yeah, I would. First, two things. I'll go touch on that, and then I want to back up to what kinds of conditions or who this is good for. First thing, this procedure works not on the basis of thinking about things, but of direct feeling of what's going on in you as you go through each of the steps of the procedure. And it leads to a release, which is why I called it the gold key release and not the gold key suppression procedure. There's a difference in feeling to release. Release is freeing. It makes you feel looser, right? Suppression just strives to keep things locked down and under control. And in fact, suppression is the major strategy employed in politics these days. Instead of freeing people, as we see in the news, there's a movement towards suppressing and controlling for the sake largely of vested power interests. My point being the difference between what it feels like to be suppressed and the feeling of what it feels like to be released or release oneself. So I've described the gold key release as a self-liberation procedure. It's something you can do in and for yourself to free yourselves from, or yourself, from the various ways in which you've gotten locked down by your conditioning, from family, as Heidi alluded to, from education, from cultural values, from our educational so-called system. There are many ways in which we acquire or collect ways of being locked up and contained. There's even a term which is the opposite direction, which is called thinking outside the box. Well, you can't think outside the box unless you're already in the box, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't even come up outside the box. So what kind of boxes can there be? Well, okay, there's frustrating situations, that is challenges in life that are so sticky that it's very difficult to overcome them, and frustration is the result. There's emotional stress from difficult situations, the common insults of life, and persistent limitations, things that we want to do, but our own makeup somehow interferes. And that can be anything from developing a skill to forms of personal development. These are the general areas. There are probably others I didn't think of, but you're getting the hang of it here, getting the flavor of it. It's the stuff that makes us feel frustrated and confined by our life circumstances, or the emotional reactions that we have to the conditions of life. So you can change your circumstance, you can change yourself. Either way, they're an experience of self-liberation from a conditioning situation. Okay, so let's bring this back to suppression versus release. You go back to visit your mother and you're kind of like expecting, right? And so to avoid an upset, what do? You try to control your own behaviors to minimize the chance of an upset. We call that suppression. Whereas if you were releasing your internal disturbances and your expectations and all of your memories of how things had been, which, by the way, I know is kind of a tall order to say right now, easier said than done. And by the way, that's why there is a gold key release, because it's vastly easier. When you release that stuff, you feel free instead of feeling like you have to guard what you say and what you do, which is suppression. Instead, you free yourself from that unconscious conditioning so that you can be much more free and spontaneous, which, by the way, encourages them to be much more free and spontaneous. They feel like they have more room to be themselves. And the crankiness decreases in them as we are increasingly free. Not altogether and absolutely, because they have their own stuck places. So I'm not saying it as an absolute. I'm saying as a trend and as a flavor of experience. And that's why release over suppression. Yes, it's true. There are circumstances that seem to lock us in. What we can do, though, is dissolve our troubled reaction to it so that we have a great deal more ease and patience in the midst of it. And because we're freer in ourselves, we are more resourceful for coming up with changes that we can make even within the confines of those stuck situations, creative responses that enable us to improve the situation or even change it altogether. So yeah, no doubt about it. There are, you can call them locks from outside, and this procedure can make those locks feel a lot easier to take prior to actually being able to change the circumstance, the situation.